The actual arc of Barnum's life is much more interesting and much more consequential than his present-day reputation suggests. He may have begun his career as a promoter of sketchy acts in a business that was often considered less than respectable, but he changed both himself and the business over the decades, earning the respect of Americans of every station. Because he had so determinedly placed himself in the public eye, people knew all about his early missteps as well as his early successes, his struggles and his triumphs. He did not hesitate to show his flaws, but he would also reveal in time that he was that rare thing, a man who was steered by his ideals, becoming a better person as he navigated a long lifetime. Over many years, Barnum became a steady, civic-minded, fun-loving man who cultivated a close relationship with his audience and embodied many of the best aspects of the American character. He eventually won over the public with his unflagging energy, his wit, and his buoyant good humor, his patriotic zeal for the Union side in the Civil War, and his commitment to charitable causes, good government, and his faith. He is known today primarily for his connection to the circus, but that only came in the last quarter of his life. His principal occupation before that was running the American Museum. Less well known today is that he was also a best-selling author, an inspirational lecturer on temperance and on success in business, a real estate developer, a builder, a banker, a state legislator, and the mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut. In all of these endeavors, he was a promoter and self-promoter without peer, a relentless advertiser, and an unfailingly imaginative concoctor of events or exhibits to draw the interest of potential patrons. By the end of his life, he was admired and respected, not only in the United States, but also across much of the globe. He had become as close to a global celebrity as a person could be at that time. After Ulysses S. Grant's second term as president, the great general made a 2-year tour around the world, promoting the United States. Upon his return, Barnum said to him, "General, I think you are the best-known American living." To which Grant replied, "By no means. You beat me sky high." For wherever I went, the constant inquiry was, "Do you know Barnum?" Barnum, who was born 10 years into the century and died 9 years before its end, embodied the period's great narrative of breaking social boundaries. Americans often saw him as an exemplar of what it meant to be one of them. Europeans saw him as a representative of the American character. He was born into a family that had to hustle in its small Connecticut village to stay solvent. Through hard work, a lot of brass, and a genius for exploiting the new technologies related to communication and transportation, he became world famous and wealthy beyond his dreams. And he did it all by appealing to popular taste and interests. He understood what ordinary Americans wanted. Barnum embodied some of America's worst impulses, but also many of its best. He came to represent much of what was most admirable about his young country, and he did so with a sense of humor and a joy in living that is rare in today's public figures. He led a rich, event-filled, exhilarating life, one indeed characterized by both struggles and triumphs. His is a life well worth knowing and celebrating. That was an excerpt from the book that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is P.T. Barnum, An American Life, and it was written by Robert Wilson. Okay, so let's jump into his early life. From a very young age, he realizes that he has an interest in the earning of money. And it says, what did interest him from an early age was money and its accumulation. The boy decided that for extra money, he could start making sweets and selling them to soldiers on the day when the militia trained. So let me just pause there. He's about 12 years old at this point. And his life, he was born in 1810 and he dies in 1891. So his life takes place, a large part of his life when he's a young man, takes place post-American Revolution, but pre-Civil War. And so that's what they mean about the militia there. Within a few years, he could afford to buy a sheep, a cow, and other property. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this is how he's reflecting back. This author quotes heavily from Barnum's own autobiography. And this is what, in his autobiography, this is what he says about this time in his life and about the earning of his own money, the impact it made on his mind. And he says, it made me feel that I was quite a man of substance. And having this passion for commerce, for trying to make money, winds up being beneficial because, like a lot of people that we study in the podcast, his early life is filled with tragedy. So at 16 years old, his father dies, and this leaves him as the oldest child, the person that has to work to support his family. So it says Barnum's father died of a lingering illness, leaving his family with debts. Now the eldest of 5 children, with the youngest only 7, Barnum remembered the family returning from the cemetery to, quote, to our desolate home, feeling that we were forsaken by the world and that but little hope existed for us on this side of the grave. So Barnum was born and raised in a small town in Connecticut. He realizes, hey, there's no opportunity for me in this small town. Let me go to New York, where it's becoming a large city. There'll be opportunities for me to run my business, because he realizes even from an early age that he's not fit to work for other people. So he winds up moving to Brooklyn, and he starts his own business. And what's remarkable about this section is, one, he had an insight into who he was at such a young age, but two, he's 17 years old when he starts his first business in New York. So it says, Barnum soon decided to start a business of his own. My disposition is, and ever was, he wrote, of a speculative character. Yeah, that's an understatement. And he knew even then that he would only be happy working for himself. He managed to pull together some money to buy a porterhouse for sale. And it says, so he winds up borrowing some money, starts this, small little restaurant essentially. But he doesn't, we also see right here in this next sentence, an insight into who he was probably for his whole life. And this is something that, in some cases can be a very positive attribute of his, but also later on leads to him essentially being bankrupt. I think he was almost 50 years old at the time. And it's his idea that he can never focus on just one thing. So it says, despite his resolution to run his own business, in only a few months, Barnum had the opportunity to sell the place at a profit, so he took it. So after he sells the business in New York, he goes back to Connecticut. He's got some uncles. He's got a grandfather. They all have stores of their own. He decides, hey, I'm going to do this as well. So he works with them for a little bit. He decides, hey, I'm going to open my own store. So at 21 years old, he opens a store, and this is what he learns from that. It says he opened the store in the summer of 1831, selling dry goods, groceries, and hardware. Everything. This is how he described the store later on in his autobiography. He sold everything from Bibles to brandy. This business did not go as well as the porterhouse, though, and this is what he says. Like most persons who engage in a business which they do not understand, we were unsuccessful in the enterprise. So he starts a lottery business. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, one, he makes a ton of money at a very young age, but two, he's starting to realize this is going to set this seeds in his mind for his future entertainment empire. Because he's starting to realize people are hungry for more entertainment. At this point in American history, he's living in the Northeast. It's heavily religious. There was a lot of things you weren't allowed to do. The theater, for example, was thought of as a place for lowlifes and people wanting to do drugs. Prostitutes would hang out there, that kind of thing. So in his small town in Connecticut, what they would do for entertainment mostly was, after dinner, somebody in the family would read from the Bible aloud. And so he's running this lottery business, and he's realizing, what people are saying they like and what they actually like are not matching up. And so this is an example of that. And then this is going to lead him to realizing, hey, there's a huge opportunity here to entertain people outside of things that, the church just thinks is moral. So it says his lottery work did not just teach him about the efficacy of advertising. That's something something that characterized his entire career. He would advertise heavily because it's the beginning of what we consider the mass media, and it's a way for him to accumulate customers extremely rapidly. So it says, he gets all the customers for his lottery business through advertising in the newspaper, but also for his museum and his shows and everything else. So it's something he uses his entire life. So anyways, it also began to develop his insight into the complicated nature of his customers. This is something that was true then, is still true today, and will be true in the future. So I think it's very important for us to realize this. A realization that outwardly respectable people might have interests that were not entirely respectable. Buying a lottery ticket was, after all, a form of gambling, something that the powerful churches looked down upon. Yet lotteries were popular, not only among many churchgoers, but also, as Barnum reported, with a number of clergymen and deacons. So they'd get up, they'd preach, hey, don't gamble, but in their private lights, they're gambling, right? With whom he counted among his private customers. So his private customers, he also gives examples in the book where a husband goes and says, hey, I'm going to buy a ticket from you, Barnum, don't tell my wife. A few hours later, the wife shows up, hey, I'm going to buy a ticket from you, Barnum, don't tell my husband. And so he's realizing, okay, what people say they like and what they actually like, what their actions reveal are very different. Where can I take this? So he says it also suggests a change in the social order of the day, in which ordinary New Englanders were yearning for something more from their lives than was being offered from the Sunday pulpit. So Barnum's lottery business is massively successful, and it generates a ton of money, so he can also invest in other enterprises, right? Some of them are not profitable enough to stand on their own. One of the things he invests in is his own newspaper. So I'm going to tell you this story, but this is really the birth. He's in his early 20s at this point in his life. This is the day he becomes a showman. And so, like I said before in the Pulitzer podcast, newspapers in this time in history, like some of them made a ton of money, like unbelievable amount of money. William Randolph Hearst, who I'll read his biography and cover in the next few weeks here, his net worth, which came from a network of newspapers, would be the equivalent of about $30 billion today. So you had a few that made a ton of money and then hundreds of newspapers that made no money. So Barnum's was in the latter. But what happens in this point in the story is he starts a newspaper, he gets sued for libel, and then he goes to jail. But that's interesting. But the most interesting part of that is we see this innate ability of showmanship, because first of all, he's running his newspapers while he's in jail, but he organizes a parade for the day upon his release. So I'm just going to read the section to you. A lot of Barnum's life is just unbelievable. So it says he was convicted by a jury and sentenced that he could either pay court costs or serve 60 days in jail. I choose to go to prison. So he was doing it almost as like a protest, saying, we should have freedom of speech. I'm going to go to jail even though I don't have to. So while he's in jail, he's running his newspapers. And he makes this like, hey, I'm a defender of free speech kind of thing, right? So he says his ability to marshal not just his own paper, but also the goodwill of others was a harbinger of things to come. It was the first clear example for his flair for drawing attention to his beliefs, his enterprises, and himself. So he's writing to all these, not only is he publishing his own newspaper, but he's writing to other newspapers to tell his story so they cover it in theirs, right? So it says these communications with the world beyond his cell also allowed him to stir up local newspaper coverage and to engineer what can only be called a local holiday to celebrate his release. And this is really truly remarkable. So I'm going to just give you the summary of what takes place after right when he's released. There's a ton of people to show up, and it says, and we also get insight into, how extreme and the lengths he was willing to go on projects that he was interested in. Others might have thought to sponsor an ode or an oration, engage a chorus or a band, plan a banquet or a parade, envision 3 cheers rather than 3 cheers twice, and might have forgotten the cannon salute altogether, but not Barnum. So they're saying, maybe you do one of these things. He's doing all of them simultaneously. Seemingly small, and this is what we're learning about, what he applies to his future work. Seemingly small but consequential details, like returning to the courtroom where he was convicted, or overlaying it all with patriotic zeal, would never elude him. This day had all the earmarks of a Barnum production. So he gets out, he's still running his newspaper, he's still making a ton of money, running his lottery business, and then all of a sudden, the state outlaws, they ban lotteries. So it says the state legislator banned lotteries. And without any source of income, Barnum had to change course. He could not afford to keep publishing his paper. He now had no resources. He blamed himself for his situation, writing that the old proverb, easy come, easy go, was very true in my case. Still, this is a really important aspect of his personality, he was an unyielding optimist. So I said still he was confident in his ability to earn money. And so this up and down and up nature is prevalent throughout Barnum's life. He'll have massive success followed by years of no success. Eventually, he'll even it out a little bit as he gets older. But in his early ages, he couldn't hold on to a good opportunity for very long. So he has these periods of time where he's got an abundance of money, and then several years pass where he has none of that. And so that's where we're in right now, where he's looking for an opportunity. And I'll list all the different jobs later that he did. It's remarkable how many different things he was trying to make money at. But I want to fast forward to the part of his life after a few years of struggle where he gets his first job as a showman, as a promoter. So it's important to understand at this point in time in history. This is what the author says. Barnum's era was a heyday for human exhibitions, and he was happy to play his part. So what does that mean? There's not a lot of entertainment. So let's say any kind of oddity. So you could have giants and dwarfs, people that weigh 600 pounds, people born with no arms, all kinds of anything that deviates at all from the norm. Promoters and showmen at the time would advertise heavily. They would, dress them up in costumes and say, hey, for a quarter, for a nickel, for a shilling, whatever it is, you can come and be temporarily entertained. And so this is the industry that Barnum is going to start working in. And this winds up being I would say the one act, he makes a lot of money on, but two, he becomes infamous for. This is something that he, looks back as an older man, and he's regretful. He's embarrassed. And so he's going to promote what he bills as George Washington's nanny. They called a nursemaid, and saying, hey, they say she's 161 years old, and that she helped raise the first president, right? And really what this is really gross and distasteful for is that he essentially leased a slave and set up shows all across the country with this lie, right? And so it says, the business finally came. I fell into the occupation, and far beyond any of my predecessors on this continent, I have succeeded. So he's talking about this is the beginnings of my career as a showman. It's something I did better than anybody else in the world later on, okay? But he says, Barnum's admission that the event that would set his life on its course was the least deserving of all my efforts in the show line. By this, he meant in part that the elements for its success were already in place and required little creative showmanship on his part. But it also became the episode of his life for which he was the least proud, one that spurred him to begin to be the better sort of showman that he would eventually become. So he had to learn how to be a good person. At the very beginning, the author talks about, what's remarkable is that he was one of the few people that actually realized, hey, I have a lot of areas of my personality that are defective, things that I'm doing for money that are really gross. I need to change this. This is what they're referencing. Not only does he makes like $10,000, which is a monumental amount of money at the time. You could buy, for example, he bought a store, the land for his store from his uncle for $50 at the time, to give you kind of a context into what $10,000 meant. But not only that, when this person dies, her name is Joyce. When Joyce dies, he sells tickets to her autopsy. And so we see, a very deficient moral character that he works on and improves later in life. And this is one thing, again, that he looks back on with great shame in his life. And so eventually Joyce dies, and then we see this up and down and up. And now he's gonna go through years of struggle after this. He made a lot of money again, and now back in the doldrums. So it says, he struggled to find further success in the years that followed. Barnum would spend much of the 5 years after the death of Joyce on the road with various acts, ranging from dancers to a small circus. During this period, he would sometimes be away from home for a year or more, and each time he returned, he would say that his life on the road was over. I was thoroughly disgusted with the life of a traveling showman. He was determined to settle into something more permanent in New York. And none of these activities brought him much money. So I'm going to fast forward to the point where he discovers his primary occupation for most of his life was owning the Barnum Museum, the American Museum in New York City. Right? It wasn't until he's 60 years old that he starts getting involved in the circus, which he's most famous for, right? But at this point, from the time he's about 25 to 31 years old, this is a list of jobs that Barnum tried. He was a dance troupe promoter. He was a traveling showman, which I already told you about. He tried to manufacture cologne. He tried to manufacture something called bear's grease. He sold Bibles. He was a clerk for a horse show. He was a copywriter, and he was a freelance fiction writer. So he's doing everything he possibly can. And he's going to give us his own description about this period of his life, which was, not very successful, not very happy. After a few months of barely getting by with these activities, months in which the family's health he's got married, now he's married with kids, had turned from excellent to poor, Barnum later wrote, "I began to realize seriously that I was at the very bottom of fortune's ladder, and that I had now arrived at an age when it was necessary to make one grand effort to raise myself above want." He heard that Scudder's American Museum was looking for a buyer. This collection of curiosities was located on Broadway in New York City. I just want to pause there just for a second. What he's saying there is, listen, I can't mess around anymore. I'm trying my hand at a million things. I'm not succeeding in anything. I have a wife and I think 2 children at this point to take care of. I've got to go for it. It's either now or never. And this is where he stumbles into what I would consider his main life's work. He's going to always do more than one thing, but this is the one constant that he had in his life. So it says, the museum was now for sale for $15,000. But even this was far more money than Barnum had at his disposal. Since my recent, this is what he's saying about his financial situation at the time, since my recent enterprises had not indeed been productive, and my funds were decidedly low. In one of the most famous passages from his autobiography, Barnum told a friend that he was hoping to buy the American Museum. When the incredulous friend asked what with, Barnum replied, like, how are you going to afford it, essentially? Barnum replied, brass. For silver and gold, I have none. So what he's saying there, courage. I got to do this with gumption. I got to be clever here. And this is the note I left myself on this section. He's very, very clever. Barnum is always clever. It's always more than what meets the eye with this guy. It's a memorable line, and it's mostly true. He decided to seek out a complete stranger. So this is what he does. It's really smart. He finds out who owns the actual building, right? Who is this museum that's for sale? Who is this leasing for? Who are they leasing the property from? And so he goes to this stranger, this guy named Francis. So he goes out, he seeks out a complete stranger who owned the building in which the museum was housed, with the quixotic goal of persuading him to buy the collection for him, meaning the museum, for him on credit. Remember, he's got no money, arguing that he would be a more reliable tenant than the struggling Scudder family. So they're selling the business not because they're prospering, they're selling the business because it's not doing well. So Barnum goes and appeals to this guy's interest. It's like, do you want this massive building that you own just to sit empty? No, you do not. So I can run this business. I can get customers. I can make it a profitable endeavor. And if I'm profitable, then you have a tenant. So it says this against all the odds, Barnum was able to do. And that's another thing to note about Barnum. He was an extremely good talker. That phrase is in the book over and over again. And he's an extremely good writer. He's very persuasive, and so much so that he, part of the way he's able to, let's say 2 or 3 decades in the future from where we are in the story right now, when he goes bankrupt, he gets out of bankruptcy in large part because he does this public lecture series. People will pay to hear him speak because they find him so fascinating, and he puts on such a good show. So, but I want to talk about why was he able to build a successful museum where this previous owner, this previous family was not, and it goes back to the insights that he derived when he was running his lottery business. He's like, well, there's a growing middle class in America, and they clearly have this desire, this hunger for different forms of entertainment. So this section is about the customers that he wanted and how he positioned his product, which again, very, very clever on his part. Barnum wanted to attract this rising middle class and the aspiring members of the surrounding neighborhoods. They had more money and were more likely to spend it on wholesome activities. So this is another thing to know about Barnum. He later in life, he wants to be thought of very similar to almost like Walt Disney, like somebody that made wholesome family-friendly entertainment. So it says, they were more likely to spend it on wholesome activities, and with their higher rates of literacy, they were more susceptible to newspaper advertising. So that's how he's going to make them aware of his endeavors. As Barnum began to add to the museum's collection, he continued the institution's long tradition of emphasizing exhibits that would both entertain and make his customers think. He wanted to also educate them, right? So many newcomers and tourists in New York, then as now, were drawn to the city by its promise, not just of excitement, but also of a connection to a wider world than the one on view back home. Barnum had an ambitious plan for satisfying this hunger to learn. He aimed to acquire at least one example of every single thing in existence, living or dead. So that's marketing speak. I mean, that's obviously impossible, but that's what he went around telling people, right? In the 1820s, a Scudder Museum advertisement had claimed 150,000 items in its collection. By the 1860s, so 40 years later, Barnum would advertise that the museum contained 1,000,000 wonders. And this is all kinds of just the most bizarre things, from plants to animals to fake mermaids, which I'll go into later. Just any possible weird thing that may get somebody to stop in their tracks and think, hey, what is that? That's essentially what he's building here. It was almost impossible. Oh, I guess I'm running over my own point here. It was almost impossible to describe the breadth of what the museum held even before Barnum acquired it and began energetically adding to its exhibits. So he would travel all over the world and just look for the most outrageous things, buy them, and bring them back. After he had been at it for a few years, the task became so hopeless as to be laughable. Okay, so one of his most famous exhibits that he was known for is this thing called the Fiji Mermaid. I'm going to give you a description of what it actually is, and then I want to talk to you about how Barnum planned and publicized his show. The details and his machinations are amazing. There's a lot to learn from this guy. So it says, this is this weird... I underlined this section when I was reading it, even before we get into like how he markets it, because I'm like, what? Let me just read it to you, and then I'll tell you what I thought. So it says this actual thing that he's proposing to be a mermaid. It's a very old thing. It's been passed around the world, right? And other people, even 100 years before, something like that, had put it on display and sold tickets to it, right? So Barnum's going to wind up doing the same thing. He just does it on a different level than everybody else. So it says it had been skillfully assembled from parts of an orangutan, a baboon, and a salmon. So somebody put the bottom half of what a mermaid, you have like the fin, or like the fish part of a salmon, right, as the mermaid's tail, and then the top half is the combination of orangutan and baboon. Her eyes were fake. Her nails were made of horn or quill. Her breasts had been stuffed so that they hid the seam between the ape and the fish, where they sewed them together. And then there was like a post-mortem done on it. So it's like the person performing this had been able to feel where the bones of the arms had been sawed to make the proportions closer to that of human rather than orangutan. So they're saying that's what a mermaid is. It's half human, half fish, right? In this case, it's orangutan, baboon, and salmon. So I read that. I'm like, there's a human being at some point had access to all these different... Who has access to orangutan and baboon parts? And then I guess the fish is easier to run into. And then takes the time to saw them together and to put it together. Like, this is just really strange behavior by our species here. So that's what the actual thing is. This is what Barnum, he has another friend that runs a museum, says, hey, I came across this, do you want it? Barnum says, yes. And this is what he does and how he actually markets it. So this is the interesting part. He hatched a complicated plan for engaging the public's curiosity about what he's calling the Fiji Mermaid, okay? Barnum's scheme to start the ball rolling was to have friends in other cities forward letters to New York newspapers that Barnum himself had secretly written. So there's no friends. He does this over and over again in his life. Everything he does is like this. Okay, what I'm about to describe to you. He takes things so much further than anybody else. So he writes a bunch of letters. He mails them to friends that live all over the country, and they mail them, so it's postmarked. And it comes. So the New York newspaper's like, oh look, there's this guy in Charleston. Oh look, there's this guy in Georgia, and they're talking about this traveling oddity that's making its way to New York. He's sowing the ground here, right? The letters were and then he hides it into. So he has this thing. Hey, there's a mermaid. This is a real mermaid that's coming to New York City. You might want to check it out. But they don't just write letters on that. That's too obvious. He hides his intentions with like a collection of other news in there, right? So it says, the letters were constructed as a miscellany of local news in which was included an item about the recent visit of Dr. J. Griffin, who represented, which they didn't know, the fictional, doesn't even exist, the Lyceum Natural History Museum in London. The naturalist was reportedly on his way to New York and then to London with a mermaid taken from the Fiji Islands and preserved in China. where the doctor had bought it at a high figure for his London employer. Barnum's hoaxes were always certain to mention the great expense involved in the procurement of any exhibit. So that's something he also does for his whole life. Detail meant to distinguish his offerings from the run-of-the-mill crap. That's not the word they use, but that's what they mean. He also tucked in the winning and irrelevant detail that the aptly named Dr. Griffin was recently from Pernambuco, an exotic and mildly romantic name to the American ear, even if the possessor of that ear didn't know that this is actually a real place in Brazil. So he always makes things he wants you to know, hey, it's exotic and it's expensive, right? His careful attention to such seemingly small matters, similar to that he had shown in planning the celebration of his release from jail years before, undoubtedly distinguished him from others in his line of work. A different newspaper fell for this and published each of these letters. So, not the same newspaper. So he's going to get free newspaper coverage from multiple newspapers. They're all falling for the same trap, right? In which the non-mermaid news was plausible enough. And in the third letter, the writer suggested that the New York editors really ought to go out and see this specimen for themselves. Before that would happen, a meeting was arranged with local reporters in Philadelphia, where they were introduced to the mermaid and to Dr. Griffin, who was in reality none other than Levi Lyman, which was Barnum's employee. Barnum reports with evident satisfaction that the plan worked admirably, and the columns in Philadelphia papers served to further entice the New York press. So after this happens, it says New York newspapermen were clamoring to see the mermaid. In the meantime, Barnum commissioned highly idealized engravings of beautiful, full-breasted, unclothed mermaids with flowing blonde hair, clearly meant to imply that this is what the Fiji mermaid had once looked like. He added write-ups proving, in quotation marks, the authenticity of these formerly fictional characters. Barnum offered you're going to see more of his machinations here, right? Barnum offered 3 different New York papers exclusive access to one of the images and a report which he modestly acknowledged was well written. All 3 papers ran the exclusive on the same Sunday morning. So the show hasn't started yet, but he's not done promoting. So it says, at this point, Barnum released for sale on the streets at a penny apiece 10,000 copies of a pamphlet that contained all of the images and stories he had prepared. Then he rented the concert hall on Broadway and placed advertisements in the paper saying Dr. Griffin and the mermaid would be on exhibit positively for 1 week only. So he's got a fundamental understanding of salesmanship and human nature. He does this over and over again. Says, okay, I'm going to have this exhibit. It's only going to be here for 1 week, and then it's going to go to London. And then when the week's up, he says, oh, the ship is delayed. It's going to be here for another 3 days. Jump on it. Oh, okay, it's going to be here for another 2 days. It leaves like 2 months later. So he understands that when you tell people, hey, you have a finite amount of time to do this, they're more likely to act now, which is exactly what he wants. It says, when the week was up, Barnum was ready to advertise that he had acquired the mermaid. He owned the mermaid the whole time. He had acquired the mermaid for a precious sum, of course. There's that same MO there, mentioning how much money it cost him, for his museum, where it would be displayed at no charge beyond the usual admittance fee of a quarter. So think about how much publicity that he rounded up for the mermaid. And then after the fact, now it's like, oh, don't worry, the week's up, but guess what? I own it now. Just come to my museum. It's only a quarter, and you get to see 150, 200, 500,000 things you've never seen in your life. And so the author quotes heavily from Barnum's own autobiography, and this is Barnum in his autobiography writing later on, like looking back at this point of his life. He says he wrote that his purpose in displaying the mermaid had been mainly to advertise the regular business of the museum. So that's what he's saying. This is the whole point of me doing all this, right? This is my plan the whole time. He considered it effective indirect advertising. Remember that. He talks about indirect advertising all the time, not in those words, but in his actions. He says he is compelled to point out that as the exhibit... Oh, so he also he puts it in the museum and then he sends it off for traveling shows. And what happens is people see it, maybe 500 miles from New York City. When they go back to New York City, they're gonna know, hey, American Museum, Barnum Museum, I should go there. So it says he's compelled to point out that as the exhibit subsequently traveled the country, the fame of the museum wafted from one end of the land to the other. And he knew that every dollar that he sowed on advertising would return in tens and perhaps hundreds of dollars in a future harvest. And one thing to know about Barnum is he never rests on his laurels. He's always constantly challenging himself rather. And I'm going to fast forward in the story. He does an extremely successful turnaround in the museum. So he goes from being broke and debt to within 2 years making money and paying off his debts. And he decides, hey, I want to be I want to be known all over the world, not just in America. So he's going to travel to England. So he starts crying because of this too. So it says all those tears, the mixture of joy and regret, suggests that he was honestly sorry to be leaving his wife, children, and members of his broader family, and the comfortable home and work that he had built for himself in just 2 years. He had now paid off all his debts from the museum and created a handsome surplus in the treasury. That's Barnum's words. He now felt confident in his success and believed that his business had long ceased. This is a really interesting way to think about it. He didn't know when he bought the museum it was going to be successful, so he calls it an experiment. But now, once your business is on solid footing, it's obviously different, right? So he says, he now felt confident in his success and believed that his business had long ceased to be an experiment and was now in perfect running order. He had realized his ambitions in an amazingly short amount of time. Obviously, he went through years of struggle before he did that. So I'm saying short amount of time in the sense that he turned it around in only 2 years. The challenge was the new place itself, a place that he had no notion of who P.T. Barnum was. Whether or not he would succeed in the land of his forebears would be a test for Barnum of his own worth and how far he had come or how far he might yet go. So what he's doing at this time, he's running the museum, but he also runs across a lot of people, send him, say, hey, they know he's attracted to oddities because that's what his museum is about. So there is this, I don't remember the name of the disease, but essentially you just stop growing at a certain age, almost like I'm almost going to use an example like Benjamin Button, but that's not the good example because it goes from being old to like a baby. But essentially somebody stops growing. There's this perfectly proportioned little human called Tom Thumb, and he's maybe 6, 8 years old, something like that, when Barnum starts putting him on display. But he looks like a little fully formed human. And so anyways, Tom would dress up in costumes. He would do imitations. He'd put on like a show. And it became really popular. So P.T. Barnum has the idea. He's like, hey, I'm going to take this show to Europe. And so that's what's happening at this time of the story. And so he's met with massive success in Europe. Tom Thumb winds up performing for the royal families in, I think, England and France. It's remarkable. He winds up performing for Abraham Lincoln back in America. It's remarkable all the people's lives that Barnum intersected with, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. I'll tell you more about later. But I want to hit on this story right here, because it gives you an insight into his personality, just how full of energy that Barnum had. And so there's a writer in England called Albert Smith, and he spent a day sightseeing and shopping with Barnum. Okay, so Barnum's out there looking for stuff for his museum, and it starts at 5 a.m. when Barnum starts knocking on Smith's door at 5 a.m. He's like, all right, let's get going. And Smith's like, well, who's this crazy character? So it says, Smith wrote, this is now Smith reflecting on this crazy day that he spent with Barnum. Smith wrote that he saw more in that day than in any other day of his life. And over supper, Barnum had told him that a person must make 30 hours out of 24 or he would never get ahead. There was a bull in the china shop aspect to his sketch of Barnum, whose energy and self-confidence were portrayed as overwhelming to the point of rudeness at times. So I'm going to fast forward to the end of his time in Europe. It's mind-boggling how profitable some of Barnum's shows could be. Remember, he's just a promoter. So he promotes Tom Thumb, he promotes another like Swedish singer, and every time he makes tens of millions of dollars. In many cases, making way more than the actual talent. So it says Tom Thumb would spend 3 years touring the British Isles, France, and Belgium. Barnum would make more than, so it does the math for us. Barnum would make more than $10 million in today's dollars. And they do that very, very quickly. So one thing to know about Barnum at this time is, he's completely focused on work. He's not paying attention to his family. He's traveling all the time. He's drinking a lot. And talks about, every day at lunch he'd have 2 or 3 bottles of wine or champagne and be so drunk that he wouldn't sometimes, and he'd be so drunk that he says the desire to work would like flee him, right? And so he winds up giving up drinking. And this is where we learn more of, his negative traits. Definitely gigantic ego, He could be rude. He would be drunk all the time. But we also see that he has an ability to course correct, which is what the author was referencing at the beginning of the book, that, this is a very imperfect person. But we see that he actually makes efforts to improve his life, to take in information, realize, hey, I'm screwing myself over here. Like, if I keep this up, I'm not going to like the path of where my life goes. So it says, when he returned home and told his wife, her name is Charity, what he had done, meaning he gave up drinking, I was surprised to see tears running down her cheeks. She astonished him by saying that she had cried on many nights, worrying that his drinking would lead, his wine bibbing and drinking was leading me to a drunkard's path. I reproached her for not telling me her fears, but she replied that she knew I was self-deluded, and that any such hint from her would have been received in anger. So he says that this is what the author's saying, that he could reproach her and that she could profess to be afraid of his reaction adds more paint strokes to the unflattering self-portrait of the husband Barnum had become. So, he's getting high on his own supply. He's like, people celebrate me everywhere I go. They clamor for me. I'm getting all this adulation, all this attention. I'm making tons of money. I'm getting drunk. I'm doing whatever I want to do. And not realizing, hey, I'm a terrible husband, and I'm going to wind up going down this terrible path. So it says, still, making a resolution not to drink and then keeping it took both discipline and self-awareness and constituted another serious effort to turn his marriage and himself around. That was the end of my drinking, he wrote. The feeling of relief that came from forswearing alcohol gave his life a new sense of purpose. I had been groping in darkness, he remembered. I was rescued, and I knew it was my duty to try and save others. Like any evangelist, and true to his industrious nature, that's an understatement, he was now full of the Spirit and could not stop spreading it. So he goes around, and he does this for free at the beginning, and then eventually gets paid to do so, and he just gives tons of lectures. And he essentially is just like a preacher or a pastor who is trying to convert you to their religion. He's doing the same thing. He's trying to get people to give up drinking, to be temperate. And again, like I said before, this actually becomes very lucrative for him, and it is a way that he's able to recover from bankruptcy. It takes a lot of years. It takes like 5 years. He winds up having to work to build back his wealth. So now I need to tell you about the most successful time he ever had as a promoter. And he's going to promote this Swedish singer named Jenny Lind. And I want to tell you a little bit more about, well, let me just read this. It says, the new venture would put to use all of his skills and imagination as a promoter. She's very successful in Europe, and he's the one that convinces her to come to America, and they make a ton of money. It would also give him a chance to move beyond the days of Joyce Heath, that's the George Washington nanny fake story, the Fiji mermaid, and even the most famous little man in the world, that's Tom Thumb, to establish himself as something more than a mere promoter, a serious purveyor of highbrow culture. It would also conveniently make him far, far, far richer than he had ever been. So I read that section. I was like, well, that's a little bit derogatory in the use of the word promoter there, but I really think that we're all promoters. I've been thinking a lot about like all the people we study on the podcast. Like Estee Lauder, she was a promoter of beauty, right? Larry Ellison was a promoter of the efficiency gains of software and of winning. Henry Ford was a promoter of service. Claude Shannon's a promoter of following your own curiosity. So to me, promoting is just sharing what you love. And so I think that's the way I would look at it. Now, in P.T. Barnum's case, he signs her to this extremely lucrative contract. And she's like, where have you heard me sing? And he's like, I haven't heard you sing. I'm just doing this. I'm taking this huge gamble, because he was definitely a gambler, just based on your reputation. So in this specific example, he's not promoting something he loves, other than the fact that he does want to be respected and he wants to make a lot of money. But in most of his life, he is promoting just wholesome, good family fun. That's the way he would describe it, and entertainment. And again, he built a wonderful life for himself just off that very simple idea that I'm going to promote various forms of entertainment so people can enjoy their time. And I just think that's a very simple idea. And if you take it to extremes like P.T. Barnum does, like you can build a life around that. So one thing I do want to tell you about this promotion of Jenny Lind is that Barnum is never I'm going to read this section to you, but what I want you to keep in mind is like everything Barnum does is just like this. He is never focused on the obvious. He's always focused on like the second order effect. He's always, the interpretation of the customer, what they think is happening, is so much more complex from Barnum's perspective. And it is really impressive how he's able to think through and get attention for what he's working on. So he has this idea. He's like, okay, well, Jenny Lind is super famous. She's in America now. I'm promoting her. How can I get even more attention to make sure that, there's going to be thousands of tickets, thousands of more people than tickets available for every show? And he comes up with this idea of getting publicity by doing raffling off a ticket, right? And so it says one of Barnum's most successful publicity gambits had been the auction of the first ticket. Right, so he says the very first ticket before it's available to buy to somebody else, I'm going to make you guys bid on that, and it's going to be so interesting that the newspapers are going to report, because the price, ticket prices are going to be crazy. Because, for example, at the time, you can see a show for 25 cents, 50 cents, maybe $1. Some of these tickets go for like $650. So the newspapers are going to cover it. Not only are they going to cover it, but it gives publicity to Barnum's show, but it gives publicity to the person that does the bid. So you have people that wind up buying the ticket and not even going to the show because they just wanted their name and their business in the newspaper. So it says, one of the most successful publicity gambits had been the auction of the first ticket. Ticket auctions were not his invention, but his goal was less the dollar amount he could squeeze out of the sale and more the publicity it could inspire. He persuaded his next door neighbor, a hatter, meaning he makes hats, named John Gennon, to go all out at the auction so that he could soak up some of the publicity it generated. So he's, again, it's very hard to believe, like this old saying, like, believe nothing of what you hear and half of what you see. Same thing. People, like, Barnum set up this auction. He's convinced, like, the person that's going to win, he already knows who's going to win because he said, hey, no matter what, bid. And so the people say, oh my God, who's this guy? This guy bought this ticket, and it winds up making this guy's hat business even larger. So it says he persuaded his next door neighbor to go all out at the auction so he could too soak up some of the publicity it generated. The scheme worked out at least as well for hat sales as it did for ticket sales. Gennon received national attention for his winning bid, and owning a Gennon hat became a sign of sophistication. This made him as rich as he was well known. So that's the very first time he does it. So Jenny does, let's say 100 shows before she parts ways with Barnum. And eventually people realize, oh, what worked for the hat guy will work for me. And so they start bidding up just to win. And then, like I said before, they'll win the auction, and then in many cases not even go to the show. So his promotion of Jenny Lind makes him a ton of money. I'm talking tens of millions, the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars, which is bizarre, right? Because I told you he goes bankrupt. Well, he goes bankrupt after the fact. He winds up building, this is even before the Jenny Lind thing, but he winds up building this one of the most ostentatious houses that have ever existed. It's called Iranistan. You can Google image search this thing. It looks like a house that P.T. Barnum would build. This is the point. But my point is like he was very ostentatious. He would spend a lot of money, and then he could not just focus on one business. So he winds up going broke, not just of his ostentatious spending, but because he just invested in a ton of things that never made any money. And so this is another example of this up and down and up lifestyle that he had. And I think it's a reminder of what Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett told us, that you need to stay within your circle of competence. If he stayed to promoting shows, to running a museum, he'd never have this problem. But it says Barnum had been working at a dizzying number of ventures. When those projects relied on his instincts and experience as a showman, they tended to be successful. But when he was tempted by schemes in areas which he was less familiar, the results were uneven. Eventually, as his attention turned in so many directions and he bankrolled so many initiatives, his long run of good luck would come to an end. So some of these things, he's dumps a lot of money in real estate development. Think of it almost like startup investing now. All these people, all these weirdos are coming to him with ideas for a business. He gives them money. The business fails. This thing called a fire annihilator, because Barnum experienced like 5 devastating fires in his life. Houses burned down, businesses burned down, et cetera, et cetera. Fire annihilator didn't work. Fire annihilator, Annihilator, the building that the devices were being made in burned to the ground. He got involved in the manufacturing of clocks, just all kinds of bad businesses. Spent a ton of money on them, guaranteed all these loans, and then he goes bankrupt. Having made so much money from his museum, Tom Thumb, and Jenny Lind, he had become increasingly eager to leverage his wealth in new speculations, but he became increasingly careless about how he did so. Once involved, he was lax about keeping tabs on his investments. So he had ADD. He would just move. He's like, give him a bunch of money, move on to the next thing. Does that for a little bit, and they all go out. Then they all go out of business. He's like, oh my God, what happened? And he says he makes the claim that he was surprised that he went bankrupt. His financial situation was so complicated that he was forced to file bankruptcy. His bankruptcy came to be a complete shock. He said that his agent brought him the refreshing intelligence that I was a ruined man. And as you could imagine, being world famous and now broke, he's going to be really depressed. He was, forever an optimist, so it doesn't stay down long, but anybody, that goes through this could be expected to be down and depressed. So it says he added that he was once more nearly at the bottom of the ladder. Having a hard time adjusting to the loss of their elegant home and servants, he wrote that his own constitution over the last few months had most seriously failed. He was, understandably, if uncharacteristically, in the depths, meaning depressed. Barnum's financial misfortune inspired the glee of those who had long despised what he stood for, as well as those who no longer felt the economic need to pretend to be friends. So during this time, he loses a bunch of money. He realizes, these people that I thought were my friends are not my friends. They pretended to be because I could do something for them. He says it also became a morality tale of a man brought down by his own vanity. Now, here's the weird thing, though. So he realizes he has a bunch of fake friends, but he also has a bunch of real friends. And some of the people offering him loans and to raise money for him are very well known and famous in their own right. This name's going to surprise you. I've done 2 episodes about him in the podcast. Many people propose to lend him or give him money to get back on his feet or organize public benefits for him. A letter signed by more than 1,000 New Yorkers, among them Cornelius Vanderbilt, appeared in New York papers in early June, expressing support and proposing benefits on his behalf. And Barnum's response to this, I absolutely love. He says, with some exceptions, Barnum's declined these many outpourings of financial support, publicly stating, while favored with health, I feel competent to earn an honest livelihood for myself and family. He was and had every right to be proud of the things he had accomplished largely on his own, and that pride and self-confidence that went with it were not likely to evaporate even in his moment of distress. So what is he saying? I did it before, I will do it again. I am not going to quit. So now we get to the point I mentioned earlier. He just starts giving these lectures. Not only on, he wrote several books about his life. One of them is The Art of Money Making, I think, money getting. And he'll give a lecture on that. He'll give a lecture on, not drinking. So it says, Barnum now reinvented himself again as a public lecturer. He took the advice of American friends in London to give a talk called The Art of Money Getting. The basis for the talk would be a list of 10 rules for business success that Barnum had created, this is a few years in the past, for a prolific Philadelphia author named Edwin Friedley, who published the list in his 1853 book, A Practical Treatise on Business. He would deliver the speech nearly 100 times in the first 5 months of 1859. And Barnum would tell you that he had to go through this experience, to go bankrupt after massive success as an older man. He's almost 50 years old. And this is what he learned from this humbling experience. So he says, he acknowledged the business activity as a necessity of my nature and emphasized that on the cusp of 50 years of age, he had no desire to retire. His natural inclination for business would never leave him, and given his genius for it, he would continue to accumulate dollars. It led him to believe that his troubles had been God's way of teaching him to be a better person. And in the 3 decades left to him, he managed, in this regard, to do what he saw as God's will. The charitable way in which his true friends had treated him, offering him loans and even offering to buy up his debt and allowing him to discharge it at less than its face value, also made an impression on him. His quip about him being nothing without charity seems to have been a lesson he now took to heart. He would become more generous in his dealings with others, and as his wealth accumulated again, he would give more and more of it away. So at this point in his life, he's giving lectures, he writes. He's still got his museum. He starts getting involved in the circus business, which I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But he also wrote and updated several times his autobiography, and this is to give you an idea of how world famous Barnum was at the time. In the 1800s, his autobiography sold over 1 million copies. That's insane. And there was unexpected positive externalities from that book. One of them is he winds up, I'm going to read this section to you first. He says, John Fish, a wealthy cotton mill owner, attributed his success in business to having read Barnum's first autobiography. So Barnum goes around, writes his book, and then gives lectures, right? And people buy tickets and they meet Barnum. They had met in 1858 when Fish introduced himself after one of Barnum's lectures, and he professed his admiration for the showman, which began their friendship. Barnum's wife dies. Barnum still has about 20 years left in his life. He winds up marrying this guy's daughter. This guy's 23-year-old daughter. Barnum is like 60 at the time. So Fish and Barnum also become friends. They wind up touring. They wind up meeting up with General Custer. I cannot get over the historical people that Barnum interacted with. And they go buffalo hunting together with Custer right before he dies. So anyways, he's doing a bunch of different things. He's back on his feet. And I like this section because it's just a reminder that I think it's human nature. We all need something to do. I think to feel fulfilled, we need a means to contribute. So it says, it's tempting to see this burst of energy as the beginning of Barnum's second career, the one he's more famous for today, as a circus man rather than a showman. But these activities were continuous with those he had been pursuing for more than 3 decades and represented the end of one of the few efforts at which he had not fully succeeded, being retired. He tried to retire, just couldn't do it. Barnum had not stopped being a showman, public lecturer, or real estate investor for any part of his attempted retirement. But the slower pace that had left him with more time on his hands was, he now realized, at the ripe old age of 60, not for him. He tried to slow down. He had no interest. He wasn't happy about it. It wasn't that he was incapable of leisure, for he never stopped enjoying the pleasures of city life or of warm friendships. Yet he always seemed to need a clear project to occupy him. And he works, as we'll see, up until the day he dies. So I mentioned earlier the fact that his autobiography sold so many and influenced so many people. I read this section. I was like, where do I know this name from? And you'll get it here. So it says Samuel Clemens began an after-dinner habit of reading from Barnum's recently published Struggles and Triumphs. So that's the new name of his autobiography, Struggles and Triumphs. The book made an impression on Clemens, encouraging him in the years ahead as he promoted himself as a public lecturer and as the writer Mark Twain. So I realized, I was like, wait a minute, we ever heard Clemens before? That's Mark Twain's real name. So it said Barnum's autobiography meant so much to him that when Clemens felt death nearing in the autumn of 1909, this is like 20 years after Barnum dies, and so he says it meant so much to him that when Clemens felt he was near death, he says he took a dying man's solace in rereading his favorite books. Barnum's autobiography was among them. What I really loved about this book is, everybody thinks of, I think Barnum today is he's way better known as, Barnum and Bailey, the circus, everything else, right? And as we see, that was not the majority of his life. It started after he was 60, and really Bailey, his younger partner by like 20 years, was the one running the business. And so the majority of this book is all about Barnum's early life, which is why I think I enjoyed reading the book so much. And Bailey and the Circus is literally one chapter right before the end. So I just want to tell you a little bit about how they came to meet. And again, I think Barnum had a good idea here. He just realized, he's like, listen, I don't have a monopoly on good ideas. So there is this company called the Great London Circus, which is run by this guy named Bailey and a few of his partners. And they bought an elephant, and an elephant and her calf become like world famous. And so Barnum approaches him. He's like, I want to buy your elephant for my circus, because he's running circus with these other guys that aren't really good at what they're doing. Okay, so it says he telegrammed Bailey and all these other people, offering $100,000 in cash. And this is how Barnum remembers this. They gleefully rejected my offer, pleasantly told me to look to my laurels, and wisely held on to their treasure. Not only that, but they began an advertising campaign under the heading, "What Barnum Thinks of the Baby Elephant," reproducing his telegram with its lavish offer. Barnum was also impressed by how well the three younger men had turned the tables on him using his own methods. These were foes worthy of my steel, he called them. The Great London Circus had dogged Barnum's circus in the previous season, often scheduling dates in the same towns to draw off his business, something like a younger Barnum would have done. And so he says, the aging showman realized that he had finally met his match, and he concluded it would be wiser to join them than to continue competing with them. And so that business, Barnum and Bailey Circus, Ringling Brothers, The Greatest Show on Earth, whatever you happen to know about it, it lasted for 100 years. It just ended recently in 2017. And Barnum largely let Bailey run it. I got to see if there's a biography on him because he just seems to be a very formidable and clever person. And at this stage in Barnum's life, Bailey could run the day-to-day. Barnum could still do the promotions, still leverage all of his celebrity, leverage his contacts in the media. But Bailey is really the one responsible for the massive business success that Barnum and Bailey wind up being. And so I want to close on this. He's right before he dies, he's giving an interview to a New York newspaper man who, he told the reporter he says in the last great understatement of his life that he was always glad to meet a newspaper man. That's an understatement, as he says. So it says 2 days after the interview, he asked Nancy, that's his second wife, the one he was married to for the last 20 years of his life. 2 days after this interview, he asked Nancy to stay with him every moment of the little time that is left. And at midnight on the following day, his heartbeat grew irregular. Those in the family not already present were wired that his hours left on earth were few. Soon his heart began to beat faster and faster, and then slower and slower. And just after 6:30 p.m. on April 7th, he died. The newspapers that had been his lifeblood did not desert Barnum upon his death. The New York Times weighed in with a 6,000-word obituary, and the Times of London called him an almost classical figure. Hundreds of newspapers across America shared the sad news with the millions of their readers who had visited the American Museum in their youth, or more recently, attended a Barnum and Bailey extravaganza in their city or town. Barnum rested at last, but the spectacle he had created would, decade after decade, continue to bear his name and delight the millions who would see it. What a remarkable life story. That is 137 books down, 1,000 to go. If you want the full story, you can buy the book using the link that's in your show notes on your podcast player, or go to founderspodcast.com, and you'll be supporting the podcast at the same time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.